Hey there, and welcome back to Modern Learning on the Air. I'm Jeff Brown, and today we're talking about something that really can shake up how organizations learn organizational learning and communities. We'll dive into how these communities can boost engagement, participation, and ultimately make learning stick in a big way. We've got two fantastic guests with us today. First up is Andy Lancaster, author of Organizational Learning Communities, Empowering Social Learning and Collaboration to Improve Performance. Andy's going to share how building learning communities help create culture of consistent improvement and innovation, key ingredients for both personal and company-wide growth. Also joining us is Jen Finnan, a thought leader in learning and development. Jen's been leading the charge on turning static knowledge bases into thriving communities of practice. Together, Andy and Jen will unpack some great strategies to help your organization get the most out of its learning environments. Before we dive in, let's get to know our guests a little bit better. Andy, can you start out about your background and what drew you to the world of learning communities?
Yeah, so I've got a really bizarre 30-year career, and it definitely wasn't planned. It's often the way sometimes our careers are structured. So my first degree was in education and design. So I trained as a furniture designer and silversmith, but with education, and my intention was to go into school teaching to teach kids design. But pretty soon I did a master's degree in instructional design, and I ended up lecturing back at university. So I guess from early on, the whole concept of designing learning has been really at the heart of what I've been interested in. So I was then an instructional designer for a US multinational company working in computer-aided design. And then I spent 5 years in prison, which is always a fascinating one to throw that one in when you say you've spent time in prison. But I was head of HR and learning for one of the UK's largest substance misuse charities, working with heroin addicts and those with substance issues, which was a fascinating. We'll probably return to that in terms of the power of communities. Then, since then, worked in a big social organisation working with adults with dementia. And then most recently, I spent 10 years as head of learning at the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development, an organisation called CIPD, which is a massive global membership body for learning. And then, a few months ago, I launched my own consultancy, Reimagine People Development. So when you look at that, if you look backwards on this, it's a crazy career, but I guess I've had the opportunity to be involved in lots of different circles, which has been fantastic.
That's impressive. The prison part kind of threw me for a minute there, but that's awesome. Thank you so much. Jen, I would love to have you introduce yourself to
I'm not sure how I can follow that as an introduction, Andy, but I'm Jennifer Lindsay-Finnan. I'm a virtual learning expert here at InSync Training. So that means that I get to design, facilitate and produce our programs from my home office here in Perth in Scotland. And I also manage the InSync Learning Exchange, which is our internal community of practice. So learning communities is definitely a favourite topic of mine. Really happy to be here. I've worked virtually for over 10 years. And before that, I was often like the only trainer in a company. So for a long time, I've sort of felt that need to be part of communities where all the other L&D people are, so that I can sort of hang out with them and talk to people who actually understand what I do. So again, learning communities is something that I'm really passionate about.
Oh, well, thanks, Jen. That was awesome of that aspect of it. And so now I kind of want to go into the vision of learning communities. And Andy, I kind of want to go to you on this one. Could you share your vision of organizational learning communities, kind of as presented in your book, and what are the key principles that underpin their success?
Yeah, so the book was actually written for me, and that's the best reason for writing a book. I think many of us have started books, but maybe not finished them. But it came out of a real desire for me to work out why many of those communities had not worked in my setting. And again, I know during the time we have, we'll unpack some of the reasons for that. And when I talked to other learning professionals, often people just talked about communities of practice. And we need to kind of reference the work of Etienne Wenger-Trainer, who's done some fantastic work over many years. But I wanted to kind of dial back a little bit before that. So I went back to first principles to say, what is a community? Now, if you look at the definitions of community, normally it's 3 or more people. So I kind of went and looked in organizations with a blank sheet of paper to say, where do you find 3 or more people engaging in learning together? And that really was my definition. So I couldn't find a definition of what it was. So in writing the book, this is kind of my definition. So I think a learning community is a group that are connected and energized by a cause. And I probably want to come back to the concept of a cause in a moment. And that the members interact mutually, generously, and accessibly. So there is this sense of generosity and connection around this. And it's for a purpose. And for me, there were 5 key things as the purpose. So it's either in sharing knowledge, spearheading practice, solving problems, seeding innovation, or supercharging development. So there are specific outcomes we look at, and it's to create individual or group outcomes. So for me, Jeff, that's really where it's at. And I found 10, and there are probably more. I found 10 different types of communities that exist within organizations which fulfill that bill. So yeah, that's kind of my starting point. And it surprised me a little bit because I naturally gravitated to think about communities of practice as well.
Jen, do you have anything to follow up with that?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's as simple as it's a community and it's about learning. So it has to be for learning, right? There has to be a purpose to it. It's not just about hanging out and having some decent conversations. How is it you describe that, Andy?
Yeah, I said it needs a cause.
Cause, yeah, there needs to be a purpose behind it. There needs to be a reason for it, yeah. And also it needs to be a community, right? It's not just a place for content. It's not just that sort of Netflix of learning type thing. It's got to be about the people. Right, it's got to be about the people, and it's got to be the kind of place where you can just ask questions, where you can be yourself. Right. Like years ago, I don't know if this is relevant, but years ago I worked for a weight loss company, and I trained the people who ran their own individual meetings. And a big part of the culture there was this idea of you're overweight, you're not feeling so confident, you walk into a room, but it's the kind of room where you can take your coat off and you can just be yourself. And for me, that's what a learning community has to be, where you can take your coat off, you can be the real you, and you can say, yeah, I'm a virtual learning expert. Yeah, I've been doing this for many years, but I still struggle with this, and I still need ideas on that. And that's where the learning for me comes in.
I think that's so right. I was just going to say, Jeff, I mean, that resonates so much with my time spent in prison. Because how do you, and it's a great one, isn't it? I throw that in at parties, it always freaks people out. But how do you work with people who want to see a significant transformation in their lives? And the way it works within rehab, and many people listening in will be aware of things like 12-step programs or whatever, you are with a group of people who have a very specific reason. So to Jen's point, it might be that you're looking for changes in your lifestyle or whatever. But I sat there in groups of people who had massive heroin addictions and watched the power of a group of people causing transformation. And for me, that was a trigger looking back in my career, now working with organizations, that often organizations want transformation, but they just, forget about the power of being with others. And that's a really important thing. So I absolutely connect with Jen on that one, that you've got to be with people and there's got to be reason around that. And Wenger says, he calls it a domain, but I think for me, it needs to be a bit sharper than that. I think there's a cause that we're meeting together. So that's really important for me.
So when you're saying the cause, you're also saying basically a goal of the meeting. And especially with your, I have to chuckle every time I hear that when you were in prison, the way that's stated. But is there any examples from that where the community really came into, like, either help a person that was in a bad state to change their perspective or change their mind, that you could share with us?
Yeah, and that's a really fantastic invitation for me to share a brilliant story about. Jen will know this. So I was working. We had not only prison. I'm going to stay with this one for a minute because this is so powerful, and I know we'll flip to some of the organisational stuff. But I was working in a community-based project in Glasgow, Jen. A very tough place in Glasgow, and these guys, it was a men's group. These guys were looking to see transformation in their lives. And do you know what? There was a massive argument over the last slice of bread. which had been taken at the meal, and it was really quite, and I was watching this thinking, this is really edgy. But you know what? Out of that, Jeff, came a conversation. It was nothing to do with the slice of bread. It was to do with how do we respect each other and be around each other and recognize that, do you know what? Just asking would have been the most appropriate thing to have done. So I think, to Jen's point, when there's mutuality, when there's respect, and you say when there's a problem to solve or whatever, these connections are so important. And for me, it's really interesting. I think, obviously, we're post-COVID now, but we lost something of human connection during COVID. Many organizations are trying to get that back again. And also, I'm really pro-AI, but each of us interacting with large language models is not going to solve all of this. So I think even within, and ironically, AI, we're all talking to AI. So in one sense, we're in a virtual community anyway. We're just chatting to an artificial intelligence system. But Jeff, for me, I think many organizations are trying to recapture now that almost that essence of what happened in that Glasgow service, that with great relationships, we can actually unpack to a different level of relationship and a different level of solution, which is really powerful. So I think organizations are really, this is a prime time for us to be thinking about realizing the power of communities.
Indeed, it's not just about hybrid working. I think as L&D professionals, we are kind of used to working on our own. Like you're on your own at the front of a training room, or you're on your own trying to design some materials. And we all love that connection. That's why we do what we do, because we love making those connections with our learners. So we need to be able to do that for ourselves. And also your point about AI, like I use AI all the time as well now, but sometimes you just want an actual human being, because you just want to say, that activity that we always run at the start of that particular course, how does it actually work for you? Because it doesn't work that well for me. Or what's a better way to debrief this? Like AI could give you 10 different ways to debrief something, but only a real human being that's experienced it can share actually how effective it is,
Yeah. Well, yeah, I fully agree with that, because it goes from a standpoint, you need the response. You need, a feeling behind the words. An AI is great. It'll give you an analytical version of what makes sense, right? But it won't give you the feeling behind it, because you could have, a great conversation that could be about a slice of bread, but the context behind it, the feelings behind it, you're not going to get from a machine. And that, I feel like, especially with when you brought up COVID, we went from in person, face to face, talking to people every day, brainstorming, doing everything, doing the knock on the office, going, hey, what do you think? Right? To, hey, I got to call you on Teams, ding, 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 right? Which almost becomes annoying to a certain extent, because you're like, oh, well, I'm working. You know what I mean? And it's like, oh, now I have to answer this. Versus when people are in offices and in face-to-face, you just knock on the door and you get that instant reaction from there. But that also kind of guides us to my next question, which is about transforming learning exchange. So this is to you, Jen. How do you envision transitioning knowledge bases into communities of practice? And what would the unique opportunities do you see arising from this shift?
Yeah, I mean, it's got to be about the people, hasn't it? And you mentioned that sort of learning exchange there. It's all about the give and take, isn't it? And I don't know if it's an L&D thing or if it's a human thing, but I think a lot of us love that idea of giving as well as taking, right? We're not just learning stuff for ourselves, but we're also sharing those experiences. We know how rewarding it is when someone asks us, Andy, how was that for you? Like, how does that work? I want your opinion. So I think it is about, that exchange.
I think as well, for me, it was really, really interesting. I'm going to just head into the concept of guilds, because that really picks up on what you've just shared. So I mentioned we often think of communities of practice. So there are, there's many other expressions of this, coaching and mentoring circles, buddying, action learning sets. There's all sorts of things. But in the UK, it's really interesting. If you go back into the 1800s, there were these workplace guilds. And I think probably, I haven't had time to research, but I'm guessing in most cultures there were. So if you think back to things like stonemasons who actually built in the UK, built these wonderful cathedrals. And I was speaking about 6 months ago. These are called worshipful communities, Jeff, if you've not come across these, because they're very, very British. There was a worshipful community of launderers. I was speaking at this place, and this is not money launderers. These are people who did the laundry in, like, I guess the big house or whatever. And I went in there and there was all these wonderful display cabinets with how you iron all these different things to the highest standard. And to what Jen was saying there, it's really interesting. This is about guilds, and guilds were where people altruistically, generously, you had masters who were brilliant at what they did, and then you had what was called journeymen or women who were proficient, and then you had the novices who came through. And it struck me in writing the book that we are recapturing the concept of guilds within organizations where you get this transfer of information. And it's really interesting. There's a case study in the book. Bloomberg, who do the big technology systems for finances, they actually now use the word guilds, which I found fascinating. So they have guilds around particular areas of technology experience. So I think it's powerful that we're now, if we're looking at knowledge transfer and we're looking at practice transfer, that these are absolutely cutting edge ways of doing it. It's not about sending people on courses. It's about gathering them together in life-giving communities. And that's where a lot of our learning, and hey, this is how children learn. This is how people in cave times learn. This is how animals share knowledge, and it is through community. So this is just a very powerful mode of providing learning or accessing learning.
Yeah, and in your book, Andy, you talked about spiral communities. You mentioned there the idea of bringing, beginners together with more experienced people, and you can see the advantage of doing that because that's where all the great knowledge sharing comes in. But I can also see some challenges with that. Can you tell us? Because you can describe it much better than I can about this idea of the spiral community.
Yeah. Well, obviously, I guess having done my master's in instructional design, I did plenty of stuff around spiral curriculums. We know how these things work. You start with the easy stuff and you go a bit more and you come back to the topic and you go higher. And I was thinking, some of the communities I've been with have got these different levels. And if you take the guild model, it's really interesting. So you've got your masters, you've got your journey people who are but they're called journey people because they were proficient, so they could travel and go somewhere else, and they were good enough to be able to, if you're building a cathedral, you could go to the next town and do that. That's why they're called journey people. And then the novices. So it just struck me that this is a spiral community, but what you can have is this genius stuff where the seniors can be more mentors. So that's where your mentoring circles come in. That's where you could have that kind of stuff going on. At the medium level, you've got peer coaching, you've got action learning where you can work with peers on this. And then at the bottom level, then we can, again, mentor. But what we all know that upward mentoring is just genius within organizations, that those who maybe are not highly skilled can come in and just say, why do we do it like this? So I think one of the skills of designing communities for me, of great communities, is recognizing how you facilitate the interactions between people with very different levels of experience. So the really experienced ones don't get really fed up that they're doing the basics, but they're mentoring, and the juniors don't feel totally threatened by someone with 30 years experience. So spiral communities, I came up with the concept of those, and there's some lots in the book about the different things you can do to facilitate brilliant interaction between people with different levels of experience.
With that being said, we're kind of like, with our communities, we're going from the concept, at least from on my side of the pond, it takes a village, right? And with that being in there, Andy, where does the social learning contribute to engagement and performance in organizational learning communities? And is there a strategy leaders can implement to foster it?
Yeah, but there definitely is. I love the village thing. That's really true, isn't it? Because most of us, the connection is in the local. And even if we live in a huge city, we're often in a district or a street, those kind of things. And certainly during COVID, our streets, certainly where we lived, were crucial for that kind of support. So I think the performance thing, if we're really serious about performance, it does start with cause. So where I've made mistakes in the past is creating community for the sake of community. And what I've often done is try and bolt it onto a program. So I'm going to run a management development or a leadership development program, and hey, we'll throw a community in there as well. But there has to be a real reason for that one. So, for instance, if it was a leadership program, it might be, how do we effectively use AI in our current leadership practice? Now, that is a cause which people will gather around rather than saying, hey, we've got a leadership community. So for me, it actually comes back to, if we're interested in performance related communities, for me, it's those 5 things again. So is sharing knowledge. It's Ken Blanchard says none of us is as smart as all of us. So it is about that real thing. Maybe this is about how do we share knowledge to be really effective. It could be, we've already talked quite a bit about practice sharing. A couple of ones which are really interesting, the problem solving and the innovation are really, a lot of organizations, certainly on innovation, there was a McKinsey report which said, I think 80% of senior executives said we need to be more innovative. Now, here's a fascinating one which I've got in the book. So we look at Apple, or we look at Silicon Valley, and we look at these big corporates, we think, if only we could be as innovative as that. Well, Apple started in a garage in Menlo Park. So Jeff, to your point, Menlo Park garage, Wozniacki and a few buddies sharing computer bits, soldering stuff together, trying to work out how to make those first computers. And you go from a garage to the spaceship HQ of Apple. So I think, again, it's absolutely, we gather people. So it might be performance, might be problem solving, it might be seeding innovation, and particularly around development. I think as well, we're all very conscious of some of the most powerful development for people is self-directed. It's not the generic programs, and it's really tricky to do that kind of stuff. But again, if we have communities, it does give people some autonomy. I guess this goes back to Deci and Ryan's self-determination theory. We're talking about how do we get competent? Well, it is about autonomy. I can do stuff, but the key thing is relatedness, which is in there. So for me, Jeff, I think it is, you get the purpose, but then you begin to unpack, why are we doing this? And it's those kind of interactions that are just so performance driving.
Well, yeah, I find that fascinating from the standpoint with the Apple reference, because you got Steve Jobs and you got Wozniak, right? And Wozniak was the computer guru, and Jobs was the innovator, right? The idea guy. And they started that domino effect, and they put people in the right positions at the right time to build that community that they came up with. And to your point, they started in the garage and started selling it piece by piece out of that. And by building their community and their knowledge set, they built it up to what it is today. And so I really find that fascinating from that perspective, because that really takes it down from a macro level down to a micro level of how that was developed that's kind of how it's developed in any small business to large business.
Yeah, and I think you raise a really important point. One of the mistakes I've made is, I tend to hang around with people who are like me. And I think where you see the real innovative organizations, they gather communities where there is real diversity, because we get, and again, I cover it under the culture section. Maybe I'll just throw the 7 C's in a minute, Jen. That might just be worth throwing those in. But if you look at culture, groupthink and bias are just inherent in many organizations, many groups. So diverse communities like they had there were really crucial. So again, hanging around with people who are not like yourself is really important. And that's just a huge learning opportunity when and again, it comes back to guilds. They were very different people mixing together, which created these powerful learning communities.
Jen, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, just that Andy's absolutely correct, isn't he? That we all know that it's bringing in the different perspectives that really adds something, and that can increase that innovation. Like, Jeff, you're from a different background to myself, and yet when we have a conversation about something, you can just share something, and I'm like, I didn't even think about it like that. Because we're using the same technology, just in different contexts. So it's those sharing of ideas. And I think, Jeff, you asked something about engagement earlier on as well. And I think if we want to have a successful learning community that is full of diversity, that's full of different people sharing their perspectives, again, we need to make sure that it's a really safe place, don't we? And for me, it always comes back to the InSync Training's Inquiry Engagement Framework, right? So we've got to have an engaging environment. Whatever platform we decide to host the community on needs to be easy for people to access. Let's get the buttons in the right place. Let's make that easy. But not only that, we need to have that emotional engagement. So people need to feel safe. They need to feel like they belong so that they can then share openly and honestly. And I think it's only when you've got both of those things in, and when you've got that common purpose or cause that Andy's mentioning, that you can then add on the intellectual engagement. So for me, it all sort of ties back to that as well.
I think the psychological safety is probably one of the biggies.
Yeah.
And I've had times in my career when I haven't had that. I've had times when I definitely have not experienced that. So I think the psychological safety is really crucial. There's a great quote, Brené Brown, who I guess we've probably all benefited from around this kind of stuff. And she said, our job is to look and say, you know what, you're imperfect and you're wired for struggle, but you're worthy of belonging. And that was a quote which really got me, that in community, okay, we're imperfect. I've got 30 years of this behind me, but boy, I'm imperfect. I've got a lot of stuff to work on, but hey, I belong here. And, I think developing the psychological safety is really crucial. And in the book, I covered a guy called Dr. Timothy Clark. He pulls out a really great model around developing psychological safety. And firstly, it's, can I be my authentic self? Can I let down the barriers and be who I really am? Then can I grow? Is this a place where I think I can be developed? Then I move on to, can I create value with you folks? Now I feel safe here. And then lastly, can I be candid about challenge? So those of you who are really interested in, those listening who are interested in looking at developing psychological safety, that Timothy Clark paradigm is a really good one, because often we're expecting people to create value or challenge when we've done nothing about the early stages about just, do I fit? So I think that's a really important point, Jen. Yeah, you got to feel safe before community is going to work for you.
Yeah, and just building on that idea of psychological safety, Andy, I think one of the concerns we have is that at the moment our community is only internal people at InSync, but we want to open the doors and we want to invite more people in. So how do we maintain that level of psychological safety when the numbers increase?
Yeah, that's a really smart question. So communities are in my view, quite fragile ecosystems. So, for instance, if you lose a founder of a community, it can have a really a huge impact. And I've been in communities where founders have left. They always say founders are people who pioneered them. And then you can bring someone in who doesn't get the, quote, rules of the community. I say rules with a small r, but there's always unwritten rules wherever we are. So I think a few ideas on that. Firstly, people have got to be joining because they're part of the cause. It's really detrimental for people to become steaming in, and actually they don't really get why the community's there. So one thing I've seen really effective is we might need to break communities down into sub-communities. So that's often the case, that we might need to say, okay, we've got a really great group at InSync, but actually, hey, if we're going to open this up for someone else, it's maybe not to the whole community. We open up a part of that. And again, one of the things I found was really good. It was one of the large health organizations actually promoted having a community charter, which is great, and let the community develop that. And the community itself works out, this is how we work around here, this is how we behave around here. So if you're bringing other people in, it's almost like they get the DNA and they replicate it. And if their DNA is not quite the same, hey, you want a stem cell transplant here, and you have a bit of our DNA because this is how we do it. So DNA is... the reason I have no hair is because my dad has no hair. I've inherited his genes on that one. But communities, you want to inherit all the great stuff, but you want to make sure we don't inherit the difficult stuff. So my advice would be, protect in a nice way your existing community, which is working. So maybe look at subset communities where you can bring people in who have got it around cause and make it really clear, this is the DNA of how we do stuff around here.
Well, and wouldn't you agree that's the difference between traditional social media communities, right? Groups, LinkedIn groups, Facebook groups, so on and so forth, to a targeted concept community that concentrates on a certain goal and a certain target. And with the psychological safety going in there, letting them have the freedom to express the different idea or a different way of doing things to that community without backlash or anything else, or bad comments or so on and so forth.
Yeah, and I think in a sense, if you're bringing people, because within any organization, groupthink we do begin to say the same things. Certain organizations I've been in, there's familiar language. You just think, that's very much our own language there. This is how we say it and do it here. But we want to bring people in who are disruptive. You only get a pearl in an oyster with a bit of sand, a bit of grit in there, which is a bit uncomfortable. But hey, the way we do it here is you can challenge and you can do all those things, but there's a way, psychologically and relationally how we do it. So I think that's really important. So certainly in my 7 C's model, which you can unpack in the book, I put cause right at the center. It's like a hexagon. I picked a hexagon because I kind of really loved the bees and the beehive kind of concept. It just kind of worked. But cause is at the center. But at 12 o'clock on the model, I put culture because this is really, really important how we do this. I'm just going to quickly throw in the conditions for communities are really important. I found an amazing university in the UK called Ravensbourne University, which is it's in London. It's near the famous, what was the Millennium Dome, but it's the O2 building. And they've designed Ravensbourne for social learning. That's how so it's a college which does degrees around mainly some of the creative arts. But I walked in there deliberately. I got time to go in there, and they've designed the place to facilitate this kind of interaction. So there's movable walls, there's studios, there's coffee shops, all those kind of things. So I think another thing for me is sometimes we need to create great environments. So for me, coffee shops are brilliant places for communities to meet if you can do that. I used to hold my team meetings in museums in London. We used to just get out of the office. So sometimes it's not only the psychological safety stuff, it's creating an environment where people can be creative and interact in different ways. And Ravensbourne, again, you can go online and have a look at that. Folks listening in, go and have a look at Ravensbourne University. The building is designed for social interaction, which is just genius.
And that leads us into something we've kind of are already discussing right now, and I'd love to bring this to Jen. Jen, do you see any common challenges organizations face when developing some sort of learning community? And, how do they effectively address them? I mean, we have our own challenges in our own community. Is there anything that you've seen and addressed to maybe solve that problem?
I mean, there's lots of things. A lot of them we've probably already discussed today, but one that's coming to mind is around measurement, right? How often have we created a community, often to go along with a course or something, and the response we get from senior leadership is, it's not being used. People are not posting in it. And so I think there's 2 points to that. One is, how on earth do we measure the success or the impact of a learning community? And second, what about all those lurkers? Like all the people that are watching what's happening, taking in all the information, but just not necessarily actively participating. And I'm sure this was in your book, Andy, but is it like 90% or something? It's really high, the percentage of lurkers normally, isn't it?
It is. I mean, there's a model out there which was based around, I think, social media, which is like 90% lurkers, 9% are active, and 1% are real high-level contributors. It's not quite as simple as that, but it's not far off, and most of us have been there with communities where that happens. So I think, should I do contributions and then just quickly, because I've got some ideas around how you get the contributions, but the impact is really crucial. That's one of the big questions. So on contributions, how do you move people to be moving from, let's call them lurkers or observers? I always think lurker sounds a bit dodgy, doesn't it?
Yeah.
In fact, I think it's a Charles Dickens quote where it says lurkers comes from somebody was lurking on the stairs about to grab someone. So I'll go for observers. Do you know that one of the biggest the biggest things for me is John Stepper's work around working out loud as to how do we get people to contribute? Because a lot of people maybe just are really worried that maybe what they're going to say is not that significant, or maybe they're going to say something that other people, well, hopefully we've got the culture, will not think is stupid. But all of us can work out loud, and the stuff we're working on often seems very obvious to us, but it's genius for someone else. So one of the ways in communities that we've got it working is everybody just talks about what they're doing. And in talking about what you're doing, it also raises opportunities for others to say, I've got a great idea. We can work with the sharing knowledge or practice. Or if you've genuinely got an issue, it's a great opportunity to say, I'm not sure what to do. Has anybody got any ideas? So on that one, BP, the big petroleum company, they ran a thing called Peer Assist, where they did exactly this, where people were working out loud. So that's on contributions. That's a really, really important one to do. On impact, do you know, that was the one the one section of the book I was dreading writing. I knew it had to be in there, but I was like, oh my gosh, this is. But it's really interesting. You said around this one that if you look at the measures, how many people have been in the community, clicked on stuff, it's not really the impact measure. The impact measure is what's actually happening in your world. So I really advocate reflective practice and narratives. And what we're finding in a lot of communities where it's powerful is people telling their stories. And believe it or not, senior executives actually do get stories. They do like spreadsheets and data, quant data, but stories are really important. And there was a great reflective model. Again, this was Etienne and Beverly Wenger Trainer and Martin Delat. They came up with a reflective model which actually looks at reflecting what's the immediate value been. And you tell your story. How has this community been immediately beneficial to me? What potential value? They go on to say, you begin to think, in my story, where does this really sit? So I think, and they then go on to applying it and realizing it, that value. So for me, qualitative data is really important for the impact of communities and getting people to tell their story. And again, you could maybe look at Robert Brinkerhoff's success case method, but I get stories as a really powerful way of doing that. And I think seniors love the narrative of someone's life has changed, someone's role has changed, our project's changed because of that. So that's where I would go to first of all, I think.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks.
We have our lurkers, right?
Yep.
That you described earlier. And those are the people that want to be anonymous. They're afraid to speak their mind, or they're afraid they're going to sound dumb or whatnot. Have you done anything, or do you have any examples of anything through your experience or in the book that encourages them to come out of the shadows and participate?
Yep. So in the 7 C's model, you've got this whole thing about contribution. So one of the C's is contribution. I found 100. Well, there's more than this, but I found out I've got 100 ideas. If that isn't enough for us to start with, so what I looked at is where does engagement happen? Now, these are some of the things. So activities to actually connect people is really important. So we need to build the glue between people before we expect them to start doing really significant work. So it's about how do we connect people. It's also about activities to create things together. So we might have a project where we work on things together. Sometimes what I find really useful is to have things which are partly complete, which people will feel much more comfortable in adding some ideas in. It's about curating as well. A great way for engagement is, and one of the other C's I've got is this concept of cadence and rhythm. You need some rhythm. So maybe curate once a week, once a month, something really interesting, which you can read and discuss, showcasing, getting people to take some time to showcase the work they're doing, which I guess is kind of working out loud, solving things. So for me, what I was finding was you want this to be organic in one sense, but the reality is most of the communities we live in and we appreciate, it could be a sports community, it could be a faith community. For me, I'm involved with a community cafe in the town, which is but most of those expressions have some intentional design around them. The sports community would be rubbish if all of the soccer people or all of the football people or all of the netball people all turned up at different times. So for me, engagement is about some intentionality, and you can design that. We're learning designers. So in designing in intentional activities with a rhythm really helps that engagement piece.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. That intentionality is something that we talk about all the time as instructional designers. And if we think about the learning community as, from that sort of lens, then it's the same principles, isn't it? It's using the variety of, short polls and longer questions and, different mediums and different ways of interacting and collaborating to try and hear from everyone. And also just asking people. I find that if you tag someone in a post or you send them a message behind the scenes and say, hey, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Did you see that question earlier? They're happy to contribute. So, for example, we've got a mixture of facilitators, designers, and producers in our community, and sometimes it's the producers that hold themselves back. But of course, because it's all about virtual learning, we have loads of questions about the technology, and it's the producers that have the magic answers. So sometimes they just need to be, brought in a little bit to share their expertise that everyone's looking for.
So I think as well around getting engagement, smaller communities don't necessarily need dedicated community management. You can run them quite effectively. And in fact, it's energizing for the community to take responsibility. But there is no doubt, again, with larger communities and scaled communities, to have someone who has some responsibility for gathering that is really important. So it may not be a paid role. It may actually be someone in the community takes this on as part of it. But if you want to have a rhythm, for instance, we're gonna have a get together, or if you want to curate some content, or if, to Jen's point, if you want to nudge someone in a nice way behind the scenes, so it would be worth thinking through the role of community manager. And what we've seen in many communities, those people emerge naturally from the group, and it can also be a really smart thing for people who are subject matter experts who sometimes don't get the recognition, but they can take some ownership in their community. So again, it's worth thinking through, particularly as the community gets a bit bigger, of having some people who take that responsibility on as part of their role.
Just before we wrap up, one thing I was particularly interested in, is there any kind of difference with the people getting involved with free versus paid communities or paid offerings in there? Is there, like, obviously with free, got to make sure it's organic, and with paid, that's a barrier. So is there like any kind of difference in transitioning with that, or is there any negativity towards it?
Yeah, it's a really, my mind is already going in about three different directions on this one. It's really interesting that firstly, communities can be open, which often a lot of social media communities are. You can have communities which have loose gating, where there's some criteria to get in. So in one of the Facebook groups, I have to answer a few questions just to get in there. And then you can have ones which are completely closed communities, which are often the pay for ones. So I think the design of how people access this is really important. So to your point, I think it's really interesting. Just because you pay for something doesn't mean you access it. I once paid for gym membership and I didn't go for a year. So paying does not guarantee it. So for me, it comes really back to cause again. You've got to really have a cause. If I'm going to take up my paid for gym membership, I've got to have a cause. I want to get fit or lose weight. So I think it's not as simple as free and paid for. I think it really revolves around the cause. Now, the danger with free communities is that they get very big and they have a very big fringe on them. So I think on free communities, again, sometimes it's good to go to people and actually say, you signed up for this community, do you still want to be part of it? Sometimes we just let people kind of lurk, and I think it's a good accountability. Sometimes people say, yeah, do you know what? Yeah, I did, but I don't want to be around it anymore. Or for others, it might just give them that prod that they need. So I think I wouldn't necessarily think about paid and free. I'd think about the reasons we gate communities. And I think it's really, really valuable to get that cause again. I tell you, I've got some communities which are free, which are cause related for me, and some which I pay for, which are cause related. So the reason for being there is the clincher for me.
I think if you're asking your boss to pay for your membership to something, that cause is even more important, isn't it? Because you probably have to tell them why you want to pay for it. So not necessarily about the money; it's about the commitment. It's about the commitment to the cause.
Yeah, what's the return on investment? I mean, and that would what are you going to gain that's going to improve on your job, your performance, your attitude towards work, whatever. What's the business going to gain out of it? So it totally makes sense on that one. And the gatekeeping thing is, I find that fascinating from a standpoint of, like, when we gatekeep, it's like we're holding a secret, right? And 9 times out of 10, the secret's known, right? It's, you just got to do a little bit more searching. when you gatekeep, you have a known thing 9 times out of 10 that you're keeping that not everyone knows, because you'd have to do way too much research on it. And I feel that's, and I like how you said it from not saying paid, but saying from gatekeeping, because that's the enticement on that aspect, but also at the detriment to it, because people could just go, well, I don't want to answer 17 questions to get into your group. This isn't an interview. This is supposed to be free and fun. You know what I mean? So I really find that really interesting on that one.
And
well,
I think I was going to say just a really lightning one on the gatekeeping. The role of managers are really crucial in this, because I was in an organisation the other day. I won't say which one it was. In the other day, and they said, if a manager puts someone on a course, there's no issue. But if they're using their smarphone at work and saying they're in a WhatsApp group, it's like you're wasting time. So part of the gatekeeping also is people being totally cool with learning in the flow of work will look very different from how we normally. So actually being on a Facebook group or being on a LinkedIn group is totally acceptable, and you might be doing some practice work. So I do think we've got to work with managers around these communities of social learning to help managers rewire their thinking around what development might look like.
With that, I think it's a really good way to kind of wrap up a little bit, but I would love to get everybody's final thoughts or any kind of practical advice that you guys would love to share for organizations looking to cultivate any kind of successful learning communities. I'd love to start with you, Andy.
Yeah, I'm going to be really cheeky. So this is the book. It started as a blank sheet of paper and it ended up as quite a decent book. Now, my take is let's get intentional. We're all learning folks here, learning design. Those of you listening in, we love learning. This is why we're doing it. So we need to get intentional. So I'm just going to say, I'm going to call out my 7 C's model: cause, culture, conditions, cadence and rhythm, great content, helping people with contributions, and also giving some credit. So for me, if you're really interested about this, I'd point you to the book. It's just got so many practical examples and case studies in, but let's get into intentional community design rather than, just hoping they're going to work.
What about Jen? Do you have anything?
Well, I would absolutely recommend Andy's book, of course. It's a great read with lots of additional resources that comes with the book as well, so it's very practical. As for advice, I would say just do it. Like, just try it out and probably start small and not worry so much about those lurkers. Let them lurk. That's fine too. But yeah, I love Andy's point about the intention behind it. Let's be intentional about it. Make sure you've got that cause. You understand what the community is designed for. That'll help you measure it, and that'll help everyone know why they should be in it.
Well, thank you both for that. That was a fascinating conversation. And thank you both for both your expertise. Andy, I'm getting the book tomorrow and going to learn off of that from there. Jen, always a pleasure to have you here on the podcast. And to everyone out there listening to us today, please share and like this video. Areas are right down here. And if you want to know more about us, go to insynctraining.com and we can talk to you about our services, certificates, and our webinars that we have monthly. Again, thank you both, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you for tuning into Modern Learning on the Air. For all your training and services needs, visit us at insynctraining.com. And don't forget to sign up for our monthly webinars, where we cover key topics and trends in the learning and development space. Until next time, keep learning and keep growing.